Random thoughts. In this video, I'm going to talk about the nightmare that the Americans found themselves in 1970 when they struggled to find how to handle a situation with one Chukwuemeka Ojukwu, who was the first president of a country that was called Biafra. Biafra is a part of Nigeria that declared independence in 1967, but then the federal military government of Nigeria fought with this separatist section of the country and in the end won, and that was 3 years later. Now, Biafra had been recognized by several countries. This was not a small event. It was a major event in 1967. In fact, it was recognized by Gabon, Haiti, Ivory Coast, Tanzania, Zambia, and it also received military support from countries like France, Portugal, Israel, South Africa, and Zimbabwe, then Rhodesia. It received a lot of, we can say, international support, and many around the world were ready to accept the arrival of the new country of Biafra. But of course, the federal military government of Nigeria was not going to accept that, and of course, the Civil War broke out in 1967. Now, the Civil War went on up until 1970, and initially it seemed like Biafra was going to be successful, but at some point the federal military government succeeded at beating the Biafran army, and it was at some point when Biafra realized that they were not going to sustain the war, they decided that it wasn't good for Ojukwu to stay around so that he's captured and may be executed, and Ojukwu decides to escape from Biafra, and he went to Ivory Coast. Now, when he arrives in Ivory Coast, that's when the Americans find themselves in a situation that they were struggling to see how they were going to handle it. And we are going to read a document that shows us this struggle that the Americans were having about the status of Ojukwu in Ivory Coast and how they were so worried that he was going to ask for asylum in the US, and they knew that if he did that, it was going to be very difficult for them to say no, but at the same time, they understood what it meant if Ojukwu went and got asylum in the US. Now, this is a document that is a telegram that was generated from the Department of State to the Embassy of America, of course, the US in Ivory Coast. And this seems like were instructions that were being given to the embassy staff about what to do if Ojukwu was to show up and say, I want to get asylum in the US. The document was written on the 29th of October 1970, and the reference is given as State 16614 B Ban 4101. I don't know what those numbers mean, but they must mean something. And it is written from Newsom for root. Now, this is what it reads. Swiss refusal asylum to Ojukwu sharply increases our concern that US haven may now be sought. We wish avoid, if at all possible, submission of an application for visa to us. The partisan pushing and howling that may emerge from such a move by Ojukwu could do much harm to our relations with the federal military government, plus damage US interest in Nigeria. Unless you perceive substantial objection, request you approach Hopet Boini and indicate US government will not look with favor on move to seek asylum for Ojukwu in US, and express hope that the government of Ivory Coast will discourage any inclination to move in this direction. End. So the Americans are giving instruction to the embassy staff in Ivory Coast to make sure that they do all they could so that Ojukwu does not seek asylum in the US. And the reason for that is because they understood that if Ojukwu got asylum in the US, then that was going to complicate the relationship of the US with the federal military government in Nigeria and also undermine major interests in Nigeria. Remember, Nigeria is a major oil producer, and maybe that was one of the considerations they were having in mind. And they tell the staff to talk to the president of Ivory Coast then, so that the president of Ivory Coast persuades Ojukwu not to seek asylum in the US. And Ojukwu never sought asylum in the US. It seems like he had attempted to get asylum in Switzerland, and it seems like that was not accepted for maybe similar reasons. And what we know is that he stayed very long in Ivory Coast. And of course, later on, he could manage to go wherever because the focus had moved away from him. Later on, he did go to the UK, wherever, and he did live a normal life later on. But seems like at this point in history, he wasn't wanted by anyone. And of course, this shows us how the West puts, of course, financial interest ahead of anything. So when they talk of human rights, it's just a talk. But when it comes to the real thing, then of course, business interests become a priority. So those are my random thoughts.